This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel, and the Israel Institute, enhancing the knowledge and study of modern Israel. I'm your host, Eran Kaplan, and this interview is being recorded on the premises of the 2018 annual conference of the Association for Israel Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. My guest today is a professor of Israel Studies at San Francisco State University and the author of several books, including most recently Beyond Post-Zionism, that was published in 2015 by State University of New York Press. The book is a post-mortem account of sorts of an intellectual fad that took the Israeli political and academic debate by storm in the 1990s and seems to have disappeared since then into thin air. Professor Eran Kaplan, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, my pleasure to be here.
So post-Zionism seemed to be a permanent fixture in the 1990s, but now, 2 decades later, seemed to have all but vanished. Do you think that down the line, post-Zionism will be remembered as a minor footnote in the intellectual history of Israel, or will it leave residues for the long term?
Yes, no, I don't think it's a minor footnote at all. I think it was a very important step in the evolution of scholarship and thought about Israel and the history of Zionism. In many ways, the conference that we're attending right here, the Association for Israel Studies, was born as a result of the post-Zionist debates of the late 1980s and the 1990s, which is when this organization was founded, because for the first time, there was a challenge to a type of orthodoxy when it came to the view of Israeli and Zionist history and the study of Israeli society. For the first time, really a critical school emerged with regard to those fields. So I think that in the history or the annals of the study of Israel and Zionism, it had profound impact that in many ways still reverberates with us until this very day. Whether it's an intellectual framework or prism that is still useful, that's a whole different
But you're saying that in the past it was useful because it enriched the study and the debate around
Yes,
Israel.
absolutely. I think it created in many ways Israel studies. I think that up until the post-Zionist debates, there was no really Israel studies. There was very much an orthodoxy when it came to telling the history of Israel. There were some varieties, there were different schools, but by and large, they told a very similar story. And post-Zionism, to its credit, challenged those narratives, those core concepts. It in many ways helped uncover what they post-Zionists called the myths of Zionism and of Israel. And I think in the long run, it's been very productive. But that's one aspect of post-Zionism and post-Zionism critic. Part of my argument is that it was a product of its time. It's a reflection of the type of intellectual atmosphere, but much more than just intellectual atmosphere, that reigned in the 1990s, of the political and social circumstances that developed in Israel, but not only in Israel, I think globally, in the West, that lent itself to this type of critique. And if I were to place it within kind of an easy mark, I would say that Fukuyama's notion of end of history is very relevant to discussing, I think, the emergence of post-Zionism.
And it's no coincidence that Fukuyama and post-Zionism emerged roughly at the same time.
Not at all. So Fukuyama coincided, he predated, but in a way anticipated the fall of communism and the end of the great ideological wars that shaped Western civilization for decades or centuries. And he predicted that we will enter this phase of end of history, which is also a post-ideological age. So in a way, he suggested we'll enter this museum of history, and all we'll have to do is reinterpret the past as a way to occupy our minds, because the future is fairly clear. It's liberal democracy and capitalism that will facilitate our interaction as human beings in this world. Israel, in a way, underwent a similar process. So in the 1990s, but starting in the late 1980s, the peace process entered a substantial movement, or was energized substantially like no time beforehand. So there was a sense among a growing number of Israelis that perhaps the conflict that defined Israel and Zionism for a century might be coming to an end. There was a sense of optimism among sections of the population. And not only that, but the country itself underwent radical changes in the 1970s and 1980s. So the old kind of pioneering collectivist spirit that infused Zionism for decades, and in many ways shaped Israeli society and Israeli culture and Israeli thought, as a result, seemed no longer relevant. Israel was transitioning into a much more advanced kind of capitalistic society that was opening up to the world, was becoming part of the globalized economy of the globalized world. International companies were entering Israel. Israelis themselves were much more able to absorb the world. And so kind of the local, immediate ideological conflicts seem to be perhaps a thing of the past. And now you can move easily and re-examine the past.
You seem to be describing two contradictory elements here. One, the end of history, the post-ideological era that sought to normalize basically the Israeli existence. And on the other hand, it opened up this space for ideology, for, as you said, it created Israel studies as an ideological endeavor. How do you reconcile
Absolutely.
the two?
We always live in ideology. There's never end of ideology.
So basically it just brought ideology to the fore.
It brought ideology to the fore. And in this regard, it was very important. As Benny Morris himself wrote in the early debates around his early work, when the Post-Zionism debate started, he said, look, the old guard of historians were mobilized historians. They were writing for the cause. They were writing for the country. I'm not sure that they were mobilized. Just as many intellectuals are. And he said, we are now a generation, post the Lebanon War, we're no longer mobilized, we're no longer committed to this communal cause. Which, in a way, was true. It did offer a different perspective. So multiple perspectives as an intellectual, as an academic discipline, is very important. As a plan to move forward, that might be a whole different thing, as an ideology of progress, as offering some kind of a political horizon.
Mm-hmm. So it was just the material circumstantial conditions, the advent of the peace process and the opening up of the Israeli mind as well, the opening of the Israeli mind, if you will, that gave impetus to post-Zionism, and the collapse of the peace process and the perhaps more defensive attitude of many Israelis to their surrounding, and perhaps the decline of confidence in their security and longevity is what brought down post-Zionism?
To a large degree, absolutely. And again, the easiest example is to look at Benny Morris himself. After the outbreak of the Second Intifada, he, of course, came out with this famous article in The Guardian and said, pretty much renounced his allegiance to a certain critical school and said, no, I have to reevaluate the position of Israel vis-a-vis the Arab world, and adapted a kind of clash of civilization outlook. And I think by and large, it represents large segments of Israeli society, not necessarily academia. I think within academia, there are still critical pockets that still exist. But in the overall Israeli cultural context, I think he was a harbinger of a right-wing turn.
So that actually brings me to my next question. To what extent was it really something that was all Israeli, that really marked the Israeli psyche in general, and not just the prerogative of a tiny intellectual elite?
So my answer would be that I believe that Israel entered a kind of post-Zionist phase or condition in the 1980s or 1990s that had nothing to do with intellectuals. That in the ordinary lives of most Israelis, the enthusiastic commitment to the traditional ideology no longer seemed relevant. The concerns of the individual, of everyday life, kind of simple middle class or bourgeois considerations trumped issues that in the 50s or 60s would have seemed almost heretical, I think, in the lives of ordinary Israelis. So I do think that there was a change in the way Israelis lived their lives and experienced their lives. And I think that this change is reflected in various aspects, in the arts, in the culture that was produced, but also in the intellectual critical schools that emerged and very much, to my mind, reflected those changes.
And for the non-intellectuals, how did it really affect the day-to-day life, their engagement with the cause?
The engagement with the cause, look at the Hebrew language. We still, when we refer to bread in Israel, we refer to black bread or dark bread and white bread. because this is a reflection of a certain austere pioneering mentality of the 1950s, where you could choose between two types. Look at cheese in Israel. You choose yellow cheese, which is hard cheese, and white cheese, which is soft cheese. This reflects a mentality or a worldview of the 1950s and 1960s. By the 1990s, this was irrelevant to the lives of Israelis. You can choose between 25 different types of bread at any supermarket, at any store. There are...
But people still do in 2018. And still, it's not really, intellectually, we're not in that post-ideological phase anymore because we've reverted, we've gone back.
We have reverted, absolutely. So I'll get back to 2018 in a second. But I do think that there was a change from the early years of Israel into the 1980s and 1990s. It was kind of shock of globalization, of opening up. Life in Israel became much more integrated into the global order. If we look at the Israeli economy, I think it's reflected there as well, with multinational companies entering the market and Israelis going and working for those multinational companies. So it was part of this moment of globalization, a moment that I think we've passed now. But that's
We have. I would still like to spend some more time on this because tell me how it's passed, how the material conditions have changed, because Israel is still a late capitalistic society,
yes,
very much
yes,
middle class, very open, very globalized.
It is very globalized, but I think that what is fascinating, and we have to look at the entire world around us, is that the very nature of capitalism is changing. I think that this Pax Americana of Clinton of the 1990s is truly a thing of the past. And just look at the recent election results all over the world. We have countries that are committed to capitalism and at the same time are advocating extreme forms of nationalism, of ethno-nationalism, putting religion at the forefront of their national identity. And it's true from India to Hungary to Turkey to the United States to Italy to China. And I think that Israel, in many ways, is part of this changing world.
Furthermore, I would say that perhaps it was ahead of the curve.
Absolutely. In this regard, I think that Israel was ahead of the curve. Yes.
Because in 2000, it was already the harbinger of similar global
In many
trends.
ways, it has, yes. And if we look close at the kind of the evolution of the Israeli economy over the past 15 years or so, and the reason that it was able to withstand the kind of the global crises that impacted so many economies in the West, is because of the permanent kind of state intervention that always exists in the Israeli economy, something that we tend to see more and more around the world today.
So actually you say in the book that you wouldn't term this latest phase a post-Zionist stage. Why? Because we haven't really gone back to the situation before the 1980s.
No, we have not.
So why is it not a post-Zionist?
It is not post-Zionist because I believe that the period before the 1980s, there was an element of a dominant political ideology in Israel that had remnants of some sort of socialism that very much informed it. There was a certain collectivist commitment that I do not believe exists today on the social economic level in Israel. It remains when it comes to security question, it remains when it comes to intervention or protectionism, but the welfare state that existed in Israel is not being resurrected. And there was a brief moment there in 2011 during the summer protests when there was a sense that maybe there'll be a going back or reverting back to this model. But I think it just passed by and ultimately left very little political impact on...
Are we still perhaps on this, I don't know, call it post-Zionist ocean liner that started going in a certain direction in the 1990s? And the sailors have been trying to steer it in a different direction. But because it's an ocean liner, it takes a long time for it to turn 180. Do you follow my...
I like the metaphor. I would say we're on the ocean line of Israeli capitalism. That's where we are. So one aspect of post-Zionism or the post-Zionist debates is identity politics, which was really introduced to Israel in the 1990s and early aughts, something that didn't really exist in Israel beforehand. And it was a typical manifestation of postmodern thought, and to me also a reflection of a type of capitalistic society that emerges in the 1990s. I think that identity politics is very much tied to the free market and kind of its logic. But in Israel today, there's also identity politics, but it's in a way coming from the reverse side of the identity politics of the 90s. So Miri Regev sees herself as a warrior of identity politics, though I think
It's an illiberal type of identity.
an illiberal type of identity politics, which in a way reflects the current economic mood as well, I think quite neatly.
But looking at the intellectuals, the same people who were the champions of post-Zionism, you mentioned Benny Morris. Benny Morris is really the exception here. He's the odd one out because he has gone back. But if you look at other people that you explore in your book, like Uri Ram and Zev Sternal and people like that, they haven't really changed their perspective on things.
They have not, but in many ways they have not come up with a new criticism or a new critical school to challenge Israel. I think that their important works came out in the 1990s. The great challenge that they put in the face of Israeli society was then. But I think that ultimately the answer that they formulated, not so much Zev Sternal, but Uri Ram and others, was kind of a deregulated state, in collection of local communities and identities that will coexist in harmonious peace in the Middle East. And I don't think there's anybody anywhere on the spectrum that any longer buys into this vision.
How do you see the role of non-Jewish, of Arab intellectuals in Israel in shaping this debate? Because, of course, up until the 1990s, they weren't really part of the debate at all. In the 1990s, what the post-Zionist debate that we're talking about is predominantly Jewish. And looking at the processes within Israeli society and Israeli capitalism, there are far-flung changes that the Palestinian, the Arab-Israeli society is undergoing within Israel in terms of the changing of the material conditions, many of them moving up, being upwardly mobile, and also taking numerically, but also substantially, a much more vocal place in the Israeli debate on politics, etc. Where do you place them in all this?
Well, I'm not sure that they're taking a vocal place. So let's look at the post-Zionist debate. There was one Arab intellectual who was on the fringes of the post-Zionist debates, and it was Azmi Bishara, who was affiliated with the Van Leer Institute that co-sponsors this podcast in the 1990s, and he participated in some of those conferences. He was involved with the OEL Bikoret, so he was part of it. Azmi Bishara is in Qatar now. He is completely outside of the Israeli orbit for whatever reasons and issues.
But in the 1990s, there was one Azmi Bishara. 20 years later, there are several, not Azmi Bishara per se,
but there are Arabs who are working within Israeli academia. They're doing research within the Israeli academia, but I'm not sure that they're putting forward a model that would challenge Israeli academia the way that Azmi Bishara at least tried to do intellectually in the 1990s. So,
what made you write this book 20 years on? I mean, is it really the absence of an alternative intellectual model that you I don't know, perhaps years before you were waiting for it to emerge, and when it didn't, you said, okay, someone has to write, as I said, the coroner's report, post-mortem.
The post-mortem.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, you do need some historical perspective, I think, to see the evolution and the narrative of the thing itself develop and come undone. So that's part of the answer. But yes, the lack of a new model, of a way to engage with the big questions that I think Israel ultimately needs to resolve. I just don't see it. So part of it was this frustration, in a way, an attempt to analyze the success of post-Zionism, but ultimately its failure to go beyond its limited to appeal to a certain moment in Israeli history, and try to re-engage with some of the big question from a kind of a critical reading of what was left out of the post-Zionist debate.
Do you think it will be resurrected at some point once the material conditions change and, when perhaps the peace process is restarted and, things that are similar to what Israel went through in the early 1990s?
Yes. If we had this interview 3 years ago, I may have been more optimistic, looking at the future. Right now, I'm less so. And it's not just looking at Israel, I think looking globally.
Are we just having a bad day?
No,
this is really my question.
No, this is not a bad day. This has been bad 2 years now, or 3 years, globally. And there doesn't seem to be change on the horizon.
Maybe if Israel was ahead of the curve in that direction, it may be ahead of the curve in the other direction as well.
It could be. Again, never say never. And yes, I'm not fatalistic, or yes, I'd like to keep small room for optimism, but I don't see it happening quite just yet.
In the book, which is essentially a collection of essays, you go back to some of the founding texts of Zionism and offer critical rereading of them, with that historical perspective that you're talking about. What is really the added value of that? What is
the added value for me is to rediscover things that in some ways were said in the past about people like Herzl or the founding fathers of labor Zionism. But over the years, the attitude kind of changed with regard to them. So I wanted to bring it back to focus. In my mind, Herzl was a revolutionary. So in rereading Altneuland, I wanted to take it away from the questions. Was he a colonialist? Was he talking of European privilege when coming to the East? Which were the questions that were debated ad nausea in the 1990s and early aughts. No, for me, the fundamental question about Herzl when it comes to politics is the revolutionary nature of his political model and whether we can resurrect at least the revolutionary spirit. He said, look, this is the current condition of Jews in history. I want to offer a completely radical alternative, and I'm giving you a certain plan to follow through. Can we engage in the 21st century with something quite as radical?
And how is your reading different from the reading of Herzl in the pre-post-Zionist era?
In a way, I'm aware of what was said about him in the 1990s. So I'm aware of the challenges.
Is it a defense of Herzl?
It's not as far as I'm concerned, but it's a reaction to a literature that has been accumulated over the years. So I think it bears in mind, and it's kind of Herzl for the 21st century in my mind. So I'm not saying that we should take Altneuland and now use it as a template in the 21st century, but if we can rediscover his revolutionary spirit, that will be the same. And I'm trying to do the same for the Bohov and Katzenelson and the founders of labor Zionism in claiming, look, they were socialists. They were truly socialists. They had their issues as socialists. They had to reconcile it with certain elements, but there was a genuine attempt to create a socialist society. I don't think their socialism is applicable to the 21st century. But their attempt to rethink a different society in a different continent that will offer a new horizon for the collective is something that we should not give up on. That, in a way, is a message that I wanted to recapture.
Mm-hmm. Would you call it neo-Zionism? Or does neo-Zionism signify something
tends to be identified today with settlers in the West Bank.
Mm-hmm.
So, no, I would not call it neo-Zionism, but
or perhaps a non-radical neo-Zionism, or not even that.
But a commitment to coming up with a collective vision, a constructive vision for the future.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the ultimate failure or hiatus of post-Zionism created articulating links between the two camps in the Israel studies discipline, the critical people and perhaps the more establishment-oriented people, now that perhaps the conflict itself has been diffused? Is there better communication? Is there more dialogue between
So
the
here
camps?
I can almost do a quick history of the Association for Israel Studies itself. Mm-hmm. So in the 1990s, when I first attended as a graduate student, I felt that this was ground zero for the post-Zionist debates. And I think that the critical scholars outnumbered the non-critical scholars. It was a very small organization back then. Hardly any Israelis participated in the conferences. So it was many European and North Americans who participated. And the critical scholars outnumbered by far the more traditional scholars. Over the years, it changed dramatically. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to find many critical scholars who still attend the Association for Israel Studies. So it has undergone a kind of evolution over the years.
It reminds me of what Woody Allen once said, that the intellectuals are like the mafia, they only kill their own.
Yes. Absolutely.
Exactly. All right, Eran Kaplan, an Israel Studies professor at San Francisco State University and the author of Beyond Post-Zionism. Thank you very much for coming on the show today.
It was my great pleasure. Thank you.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shalom and Julia Brahms, our producers, and to the Van Leer Institute and the Israel Institute for their generous support. And now we have a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you this. Please consider writing us a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and press write a review, and then, of course, write one. Would greatly appreciate if you supported us on our Patreon campaign. Just go to our website, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. We've got gifts for you, like book discounts, bonus materials, and other perks as well. Check out our archive. It has more than 450 interviews. And if you like us, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. And don't forget to follow me and my co-host, Dalia Shandlin, on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.